point, you please come back to India and you have to pay back the scholarship. That's not the understanding in which Ambedkar had gone, but they said you come back and you work for the Baroda Gaikwad in his office in some capacity as an educator. And redeem the money that we've invested in your education. So he came back to India from England and he went to Baroda to work as the military secretary in the Gaikwad's office. And he didn't take his family with him initially. They were still in Bombay because he had to find a house first to live in. And even though at this point he had 2 PhDs and a law degree almost, he hadn't quite finished, but he already had 1 PhD. And he was the most educated person probably in all of Gujarat, all of Baroda at that time. Nobody would give him a house. Nobody would even rent him a room because they said he's an untouchable. Right? And when he went to office, nobody would drink tea with him or eat lunch with him. And he had to sit in a separate part of the office. So he pretended to be a Parsi, and he got a room in a guest house under these false pretenses. And they wouldn't give him electricity at night, and he just for a few days or weeks, whatever, miserably dragged on like this. And then one day the landlord showed up and said, "I know you're not a Parsi, get out." Right? And he was thrown out in the middle of the night, and he spent the night in this park, which is still there in Baroda. You can go and visit it. And this was a transformative experience for him because he felt so humiliated. And he realized that, there was no connection between the education he had received and the reality of Indian society. He could not bring his family, he could not support his family, he could not even live like an ordinary human being for all his education and qualifications. And so he decided to leave this job, leave Baroda. He said bye-bye to the Gaikwad and he said, "I'm sorry, I can't live under these conditions." And he went back to Bombay to be with his family. And then he got a job teaching in law at Sydenham College and then in the Government Law College. Eventually became the principal of the Government Law College, and so on. And then life went on from there. So in a sense, those years were very hard. And then through the 1920s, after he had come back, eventually went again to England, he finished his education, he came back. One by one, his children died of various kinds of illness. They died in their infancy and so on. And in 1935, his wife died. And in 1935, Ambedkar, let's say he's born in 1891, right? He's only, 44. And his wife is maybe 30 something. So it was kind of a, this is not, I don't think he would have lived his life this way if he had had any options in the matter, but this is the life he had. As far as, why do we know more about X than about Y? Well, there are many reasons for this. Partly it was the gigantic role that Gandhiji played in our history. He was much older than Ambedkar, and the canvas of his historical actions was larger than that of Ambedkar. Right? He worked on the national stage. He was, in a sense, at the helm of the national movement from about 1920 till his death in 1948. Ambedkar was, first of all, considerably younger, a generation younger. But the scope of a lot of his activity was restricted to Maharashtra and to Bombay and to the Bombay presidency. Initially also he was really much more active as a leader of untouchables and in the struggle against untouchability. And he was not so much playing a role in the larger anti-colonial politics which was unfolding at the time. So his entry into the nationalist movement was a gradual one, from being primarily an organizer of, literally the Mahars of Maharashtra, then untouchables as a kind of broader category within his purview, within the city of Bombay and so on. So he grew and grew and grew, and by the 40s he had also become a leader of national proportions, but it took that time. And by the time he attain that. So in a way, I mean, you could say there is genuinely a difference in scale of the historical kind of influence and role and the action, the agency of these two figures. And in that sense, Gandhiji takes up more space than Ambedkar does. But I think that has begun to change because over time it has become clear that in whatever way Ambedkar left certain legacies because of the role he played in writing the constitution, because of the role he played in organizing untouchables and revolutionizing and creating the Dalit movement, creating a Dalit consciousness. And because of also his idea that you needed to reform Hinduism so radically that you may have to even leave it altogether and become a Buddhist. He created a new religion. So these things have a very long-term effect and a long-term impact. And I think it has taken time for India, Indians, people outside of Maharashtra, outside of the Dalit community, to begin to understand that here is a major figure, right? I mean, of course, you associate Gandhiji with Swaraj and Satyagraha, and Gandhi and politics is so much a part of our understanding of politics as such. But I think Ambedkar's role is something which is increasingly obvious, and at least among historians and social scientists and political scientists, it's something that people are looking at more and more carefully. And one of the things I wanted to say is that both Ambedkar and Gandhi, since we are talking about women, in their different ways, for their different reasons, with their different agendas, with their different constituencies, really helped in the politicization of women. To create a political consciousness in women, to include women were part of the Gandhi movements and women were part of the Ambedkar movements. And it says, they are still less a part than men are. But you could argue that this is the first time that women are entering into mass politics at all. Through these two leaders, more than any other leader. So that's something to really think about very carefully. And I think hats off to Ambedkar. He was far ahead of his times in terms of his conception of women's equality.
Thank you very much for a very, very articulate talk. I had also got two questions. One is that you talked about Ambedkar's addressing women, the marginalized women and all. Did he also address men on women's issues, or was that something which, I'm not aware of, that's why I'm asking. And the other thing is that about the Hindu code bill. Was there any discussion on why a Hindu code, why was it called a Hindu code bill and not something which would, by its name even, be more open to other religions or a wider?
Well, just to answer your second question first, it was called the Hindu Code Bill because it was designed to reform Hindu personal laws. Yes. Primarily and only. No, this particular bill was designed to address Hindu laws of inheritance, of property, of marriage, of divorce, of polygamy, of adoption.
There was no discussion on enlarging the scope so that more...
No, they weren't even able to get this through. What is the question of enlarging the scope? They were just not able to do it, right? So it was, see, the majority population was Hindu. And the caste system, although, in India, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Christians, everybody has a form of the caste system. As you saw that in the documentary before I began speaking, I don't know if you saw it. The girl who was speaking was a nut. She was a Muslim and she was a prostitute. Now what does it mean to belong to the nut caste if you're a Muslim, right? But she does, and this is commonly known in India that all communities, all religions have caste, right? But to address the caste system, as a set of codified and canonized practices and laws and traditions and customs, right? You have to look at, how are families proceeding, right? What are their attitudes towards dowry, towards polygamy, towards widow remarriage, towards child marriage, towards inheritance, right, towards divorce, right. The main system that structures Hindu society, and this is true even today, right, is that you have to keep the property within the family. Right? To keep the property within the family means essentially controlling women's sexuality and women's freedom, right? To keep women within a single undivided family. Otherwise, if they go away and they take property with them, then that ceases to be what a patriarchal understanding of property essentially is. So the Hindu Code Bill was always already designed, and it was work on it began in 1946, even before independence, right? To address Hindu laws of inheritance and property and marriage, right? And to rationalize and reform those, because without that we could not really think about a political transformation of the kind, or an economic or social transformation of the kind that Ambedkar and Nehru had in mind, right? So and I told you that Ambedkar had written about the state of women within Muslim personal law, right? He had written about the problems faced by Muslim women. It's not that he was not aware of those, right? But the first task at hand was for this parliament, which was largely composed, by the way, of Hindus, or default or de facto Hindus. Even if they were not acting, on the behalf of the Hindu community. The first task was to fix this, as Ambedkar saw it, and he could not get the consensus. He could not get the consensus. So even today, we don't have any consensus on women's reservations, right? We don't have any consensus on women's presence within the parliament, in spheres of employment and so on, right? No, it may be for different reasons by the time we come to the present, but this kind of breach or break had already become very obvious, as early as 1950, 51. Did I answer both your questions? What is the other one?
First was that he addressed women for the women's issues.
Oh, did he address men on the question of women? Actually, I don't know about in general, but he definitely specifically addressed women on certain occasions. He also addressed untouchables, saying that you have to reform yourselves, men and women, and a big role is to be played by women in this. If you want others to treat you with respect, you have to stop exhibiting signs of this victim psychology. He was very against untouchables behaving in ways which reminded them of their humiliation. Right? Self-respect was a big part of his teaching. Right? So, and for self-respect, he meant literally, ki sar utha ke chalo. Keep your back straight. Stop wearing like these weird. He kept going on about clean clothes. He spoke about clean clothes repeatedly. Wear white. Cover your body. Don't walk around like, people in olden times expected bunnies and chamars to be walking around. Right? It's up to you. If you want to be treated as equals, then look like everybody else. Now, we could question some of these, ideas of equality, but for him, these were very, very, very important, small things. And he often addressed them to women because of the kind of role that women played within families, essentially.
Any more questions?
Yeah. How do you see Mayavati in the evolution that you're talking about?
See, in many ways, she is an admirable woman, and she's a very significant player, I think. It's too bad that her politics and her party and so on have taken a back seat at the moment. I'm sure that will change in time. But really, for a Mayavati to exist at all, shows some distance that has been traveled, by our society as a whole. I think if you set aside issues of political alliances and corruption and other kinds of deviations from some ideal, I think she represents a certain kind of self-consciousness of the capacities and potential for power and for political participation and mobilization among Dalits, which is extraordinary. Now, I am not so familiar with the details of her life, except that I know that her mentor was Kanchinam, and in many ways she was his creation. But I think it's important to look at her life. It's important also to look at, this is something very interesting. I thought, that I would read about it and talk about it, but it seemed like too much for today. There's a very important genre of literature, right, within Dalit literature, contemporary literature, which is Dalit women's autobiographies, right? There is a number of these that have been written in Indian languages and translated and are widely read. And it's very, very interesting because, in a sense, you are getting the voice of the truly voiceless through these life stories, through these accounts. And perhaps, Mayavati's story, also needs to be heard, although she has obviously achieved the pinnacles of power in ways that most women never will. We have to look at her narrative also as a certain kind of self-assertion, which is truly admirable. Now, if you visit any of the, Mayavati has created these so-called Ambedkar parks. Right? She's created these gigantic public spaces which are like memorials or places for thinking about the history of the Dalit movement and so on. In Lucknow, in Noida, and various places in UP. You can see one just on the outskirts of Delhi. She uses a lot of the symbols of the Bahujan Samaj Party, of course, but also of Dalit pride, Dalit power, Dalit history, the elephant, the Buddhist symbols, the Ashokan Chakra, and so on. But she's also created a kind of a canon, right? A kind of a tradition of leadership, which stretches all the way from Kabir and Phule down to Ambedkar and Kanchinam, and then ends with herself, right? So you have these great non-Brahmin thinkers, leaders, saints, figures from our medieval history and so on, through colonial history, down to present political leaders, and stops with her, right? So if there are 12 statues, then the 12th statue is her own, right? This is now a very, very interesting thing. I mean, you could say it's megalomania, it's narcissism. How can you make a statue to yourself? As a great leader in a certain tradition. But the fact that she is there and it stops with her, it comes up to her, right, suggests a certain self-awareness, right, suggests a certain kind of historic role that she would like to play, or that she would like to be perceived as playing, whether she plays it or not, remains to be seen, right? But there are also other women in this, right? There's Savitribai Phule. There's, Ambedkar's own, I think her first wife, Ramabai, right? These are also included in this tradition, right? And finally, you have Mayavati, and she's standing there, carved in these gigantic statues with her handbag. She loves to carry handbags, right? And I think there's something poignant about this. There's something that, we can't really dismiss, or we can't really take, the fact that she has short hair, the fact that she wears salwar kameez, not sari, the fact that she's carrying a handbag, just as Ambedkar always wore a suit, always carried a book, always wore glasses, had western dress, she has also created a certain set of, persona for herself, a set of symbols of her modernity, of her femininity and so on. Which is something to be, looked at carefully. and not dismissed and not laughed at. You know, Behan Kumari Mayawati is somebody that we have to take on board.
Actually, let him ask the question first because he hasn't had it.
So what you were trying to say is that once somebody has been born into a Dalit family, he or she cannot simply transcend beyond that Dalitness at all.
When?
Anybody.
When?
This is what you said. This was the summary of all what you said in the last
No.
10 minutes. That once somebody is Dalit, he cannot simply transcend. So this is why Mayawati will have to tell us that, look, I am Dalit and I have become the Chief Minister too. I cannot transcend. I cannot never be, I am a human being. It's just like saying that he's an African writer, he's a Hindi writer, but he's not a writer.
Well, I didn't say anything about transcendence, but I think this is the nature of identity politics. It cuts both ways, right? On the one hand, it helps to define who you are and to name your struggle and to give you a condensed history of the reasons for that struggle and the nature of that struggle. That is what your identity is, right? But on the other hand, it can also, in the worst case, be limiting, because then you become always and only defined by that struggle and that identity, and you cannot transcend it, as you said, right? So this is true not only for Dalit politics, this is true for all kinds of identity politics, right? That at some point it exhausts itself, right? And it